Hey, good day, my beautiful children. Today is Tuesday, Cinco de Mayo, May 5th. So there you go. In case you're wondering, by the way, Cinco de Mayo, not Mexican Independence Day. Cinco de Mayo actually commemorates a victory over the French. Uh, and so there you go. Just a little history nugget for you guys, but enjoy your day today. So we're picking back up here with our discussion of the early days of film. And the last thing I mentioned to you guys, other than the whole George Lucas Star Wars story, is that at the beginning of Hollywood, the studios had a monopoly over the entire filmmaking process. They owned all aspects of movie making, sets and studio lots and the cameras and the distribution companies and the film processing plants and and the rights to the actors and directors and all those things. So studios during this time also bought theaters, and there were two main types of theaters at this point. You had midtown theaters, mid city theaters, which most decent sized towns would have. We have an example of a mid city theater in Bowling Green. It's the Clazel. And actually, when I was in college, you could still go and watch movies at the Clazel. It was really cool. It's kind of like stepping back in time. I saw several movies there, and there's a couple that are still in use. Maumee has one, and there's one in Bluffton, but you don't see too many of these around because they're right smack dab in the middle of midtown areas that are prime real estate. The other type they purchased were called movie palaces, or they built them. And movie palaces are exactly what they sound like. These were giant, beautiful cathedrals to film. They had gorgeous architecture and balcony seating and beautiful sculptures and paintings and fountains. This picture here on the bottom left is the interior of a movie palace, and you can see the balcony seating on the side here. And they seated hundreds. And the idea here was that they were going to try and turn movie going into an event. So beginning of this, it was called Democracy's Theater because anybody could afford to go, and so they tried to like posh it up a bit and make it like going to an actual play or theater. And big these were usually found only in large cities, and the bigger the city, the more they would have. Chicago had dozens of them, um, but you don't see these around too much anymore. The closest one to us is Fox Theater in Detroit, and they don't show movies there anymore. They show concerts and do live theatrical performances and things like that. They're very rare anymore, and they're very rare because they take up huge chunks of real estate in the middle of inner cities that, or major cities where that kind of stuff is super expensive, and so most of them have been closed and torn down or repurposed for some other use. But it'd be really cool, back in the day, to go see the Wizard of Oz inside a place like this. You look at this; it's gorgeous. I don't know where this. I think this might be the Elsinore, which is in Seattle, and you can see, had an actual stage as well as a screen behind it, and then an organ pit or an orchestra pit and balcony seating. And it would have been really cool to, back in the day, to go see Casablanca or The Wizard of Oz or Gone with the Wind or Citizen Kane in a setting like this. This is another interior of another one. You can see how beautiful that they are. All right. So during the beginning of the studio system, we have the Big Five studios, four of which are still around today, and then another group called the Little Three. So the Big Five would be Paramount, which still exists, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, still around, Warner Brothers, still around, 20th Century Fox, obviously still around, and the one that is not is RKO Pictures. RKO Pictures went bankrupt in the 70s, but they made really big movies. I believe they made Citizen Kane, they made the original King Kong. So those were the Big Five. And again, if you were going to make movies in Hollywood, you had to work with them. This is before we have independent studios and smaller film companies. People didn't shoot their own movies. You wanted to make a movie, you worked with them, and they owned everything. It was a total monopoly. The Little Three are Columbia, which is now Columbia TriStar, still around. Universal Pictures, which is one of the biggest studios now, and United Artists, which is now owned by MGM. United Artists is really kind of an interesting story. It was created as a studio created by three silent film era stars: Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and Mary Pickford, who were tired of the big studio system and broke off and created their own studio. And now, today we have all kinds of independent film companies, and every major film company owns subdivisions that make smaller films. Um, but this is how it was back in the day. All right, so we're going to go through movies by decade and kind of talk a little bit about what each decade was like. So we'll start today with the first talking pictures in the 1920s, and that's kind of where we'll end. But in the late 1910s, they figured out a way using available technology. They had loudspeakers and amps. They figured out a way to sync up finally dialogue and sounds with movies. And so we get the first talking picture ever, which was a movie called The Jazz Singer. And the very first spoken line of dialogue ever in the history of film was Al Jolson saying, wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet," which of course we hadn't. It was a really cool first line ever. So we get talking pictures, and obviously this just increased the popularity of films. Now people don't have to read subtitles or anything like that. During this time, we also get newsreel footage, which I'm going to link to this so you can see what it was like. But this is before TV. This is several decades before television. And, if you wanted the news, you had to read it in the paper or hear it on the radio. And now, for the first time, we can actually see events. So they would do a weekly newsreel that would be shot. And then when you went to see a movie, they would show you the newsreel either before the feature film, or a lot of times people would go to see a double feature. They'd see two movies, and in between, in the intermission, they'd play the newsreel. So that was really kind of cool. During this decade, this is the greatest output ever for Hollywood. So remember, this is when they did that kind of assembly line process of making movies, and they could just crank out movie after movie after movie. So at that time, 800 movies a year were put out by Hollywood. At the time, that was 82% of the entire planet's film production. Film production, and also during the 20s, the film industry created the Academy Awards. So the Oscars, which is what they're known as, they it's the whole point is to promote movies, and it's kind of a way for the industry to kind of pat itself on the back. So they created the Academy Awards. The very first Best Picture ever was a movie called Wings, which is about World War I pilots, and they've been doing it ever since. And yeah, it's kind of cool. Um, and yeah, so there you go. That's today's lesson. Tomorrow we're going to hit the 30s and 40s, the golden age of Hollywood. Oh, one last thing. Here are a couple of stars of this era. So a lot of these, like Charlie Chaplin, he was a star of silent films, but also worked up through talking pictures. This is a guy named Buster Keaton, um, who was a comedian. Clara Bow and Mary Pickford. Those are just some of the early stars of the 20s. I'll do stars for each of the decades or each of the eras so you guys get an idea. Okay, so that's it for today. Again, happy Cinco de Mayo, y'all. And I'll see you tomorrow, where we're going to talk about the golden age of Hollywood and the 1950s. Peace and love. I have no idea how to stop this, by the way, in case you were wondering what was going on right now.